Let's take a look at all the ways you can get a Rathalos plate in Monster Hunter World. Now let's take a look at Monster Hunter 1. Seems a few things happened in the time between them. Grinding is an integral part of Monster Hunter's gameplay formula, and in its long history, this grind has taken many forms and been represented in varying intensities. Grinding can be a divisive topic. Some people can feel demotivated, or that they're having their time wasted, while others love something that makes them have to play for many hours in order to get what they want. Has Monster Hunter ever missed the mark on its grinds? And what games in the series have struck the perfect balance? Let's discuss grinding in Monster Hunter, its variations, its origins, the philosophy behind it, and much more. I assume if you're watching this I don't have to define what grinding is, but just so we're all on the same page, I'll be using grinding to refer to the process in Monster Hunter where you fight monsters and gather materials in order to create better equipment. In its earliest forms, much of this gameplay could be traced back to older online RPGs, where you complete quests, defeat enemies, and fight bosses in order to obtain better gear. The grinding part being that you either must complete a very time-consuming task or deal with low drop rates to get what you want. In these older games, it was common for someone who has obtained all the best gear to have something of a sense of prestige for having put in the great amount of time and effort necessary for it, since many people would be unwilling or unable to do it themselves. You can see this represented very clearly in Monster Hunter 1. In that game, the most uncommon drops were extremely hard to come by, often only dropping from a single source with as low as a 1% drop rate. This meant that all the gear that required those drops were exceedingly difficult to obtain. And then on top of that, they had very long-term chase items, such as the Dragon Slayer, which required a truly staggering amount of grinding to ever hope to obtain it. It must not be overlooked that Monster Hunter 1, as well as its online RPG predecessors, often required a subscription fee in order to play online. You could see this from the angle that these very time-consuming grinds were merely keeping players engaged with the game long enough to keep them subbing for longer, though that's only speculation. In Monster Hunter 2, things changed. This game introduced armor upgrading via additional materials. This meant crafting and maxing out your gear was drastically more expensive in resources than in the previous game. However, this also came with changes to drop tables. Not only were some drop rates increased, but the amount of sources you could get some materials from was also increased. So yes, you needed more materials to make things, but they could be slightly easier to obtain. This would be the model of the Monster Hunter series grinding for quite some time. I've mentioned drop tables and sources of materials a few times, so let's talk about that. Drop rates of monster materials have basically always been known either through official means or data mining. You can find out that the material you need has a 30% chance to drop from breaking the wing and so forth. These drop rates are of course not entirely accurate. As I mentioned previously, it became increasingly common for certain materials, especially low drop rate ones, to be added to multiple sources. As in, rather than a plate dropping from just the tail carve, now it can come in the quest rewards, and from carving the body, and from breaking the head. And that means that while a drop rate might be listed as 1% from a singular source, your effective chance of getting it per quest, if you meet the requirements for all the different sources, is actually higher than 1%. With all that in mind, let's take a look at the modern day. Monster Hunter Wilds. Not only are drop rates in Wilds notably higher than previous games, for example a Rathalos Ruby can have a base drop rate of 7% from some sources, but they also have the investigation system. When monsters spawn on the map, they'll have an assortment of rewards listed with them. These rewards are guaranteed to drop with completion of the quest, in addition to all the normal rewards, and can contain things like gems. And then you can save the investigation to your journal to run it back several times and get those rewards every time. This is remarkably more generous than what is normally expected of Monster Hunter materials. It's not entirely out of left field though. Much of this design can actually be traced back to World. In World, drop rates and sources were buffed in comparison to 4 Ultimate, along with new additions like the Plunder Blade Palico tool, which could give you another brand new chance at certain items. World also added the investigation system, though it worked differently than it does in Wilds. Rather than just giving you rewards directly, investigations had gold, silver, and bronze item reward slots. And at the end of the quest, those would roll additional items, and the tier of the slot would have different chances for different items. This was still the most generous system Monster Hunter had seen, with gold reward slots being able to reward things like plates and gems at up to a 16% drop rate. That's not the end of everything World added though. In Iceborne came the Wyverian Melder that would let you trade in certain items to obtain plates, gems, mantles, and a few other things. This was completely unheard of. Unlike any other system of material collection in the series, this was entirely deterministic. You trade in the item and you get exactly what you want. There was essentially no RNG in this process at all. Rise, while not having investigations, would carry World's rates and drop tables forward, and then Sunbreak added a system much like Iceborne's Melder that let you exchange anomaly tokens for monster materials. So to summarize it all, grinding in Monster Hunter has undeniably gotten less intense and more generous over time. However, it was only recently that complaints about not enough grinding have become more commonplace. It's easy to find comments online about Wilds not giving you enough to do, or not making you have to farm monsters enough, or that there's no excitement for title updates because you'll just be able to make the new monster's armor after a few kills and then be done with it. This is an interesting philosophical problem in game design. Let's break it down. Grinding is basically an integral part of Monster Hunter. If you ask anyone from any point in time what you do in any of the games, the word grinding will come out of their mouth relatively quickly. When you play the games, it's what you expect to get. Many people will even talk about it fondly. Having to grind out that gem or mantle for hours. It took 20 kills even, maybe more. But you finally got it, and you were able to make the equipment you wanted. You talk about it with a sense of satisfaction, even though in the moment you were cursing every quest that didn't drop it. Overcoming adversity has a way of making us look back at something fondly. Even if in the moment you were despairing, you can laugh about it after. But there is often a breaking point, and it differs between people. At some point you may give up, because it's been so long that you're no longer even having fun. You're stuck in a sunk cost fallacy and just want the grind to be over. This is the insidious side of completely random drops in games. While you can feel a great sense of satisfaction and nostalgia for overcoming a big grind, that's only if you actually are able to complete the grind within what you would personally consider to be a reasonable amount of time and effort. This is an issue that's plagued games for decades. How much grinding is too much? You want grinding to feel satisfying, so it has to have some level of time and effort commitment. But if you take it too far, it'll alienate anyone who isn't just a hardcore grind junkie. And those people do exist. Monster Hunter 1 wasn't a smashing success. It had incredible amounts of grinding that had to be done to get any of the best gear. But people did still do those grinds, and even to this day on private servers, people are still doing that grind. And to be clear, when I say that grinding is integral to Monster Hunter, that's ultimately only my perspective. There's likely many people who don't see it that way. They may only play just to fight the monsters and then quit playing, the idea of grinding out tons of gear being intolerable or uninteresting to them. Looking at the course of the series, it's clear the devs wanted to ease the grinding aspect. They wanted to find that elusive sweet spot for grinding, where it's satisfying but not overbearing, to the most amount of people. They followed all the trends of other games that have also tried to find that same sweet spot. ARPGs and MMOs have tried a number of tactics. The player will have a higher chance of getting the loot they want when the boss drops 10 items at once instead of just one. More sources of loot increases your effective chance of getting that one item. And one of the biggest developments in fine-tuning RNG in games is bad luck protection or deterministic drops, where either through a direct exchange of a currency or some background system, the player will, given enough time, be able to get what they want with absolute certainty, and even be able to calculate when they will get it. Hypothetically, this solves all problems. If you get lucky and get the item you want quickly, then you feel good. If you're unlucky and it takes you a long time, you at least know there's a hard cap on how long you'll have to grind before you get what you want. This is not the perfect solution though. Determinism can breed apathy or a lack of excitement. Getting the item you want is a foregone conclusion. You're just going through the motions until the game decides you've done enough and can get the reward. Or maybe you get lucky and can skip the whole process. The point at which bad luck protection kicks in can be miscalibrated. If it's too short, then no one really gets to have the lucky excitement moment at all. But if it's too long, then it just goes back to feeling like a normal, arduous grind. And arguably it's worse, because you can see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's just so far away you feel it's not worth even trying to go towards. As I said, Monster Hunter has tried all these things and tripped over the same landmines most other games have. never quite finding that sweet spot and largely just making the games more generous over time. I do think people's anger at Wilds is a bit misplaced. It's really just the culmination of multiple games that had already been using the same methods of easing how much grinding was necessary. It is at this point that I must interject from another timeline. Title Update 2 for Wilds has come out, and with it has come a couple of interesting developments related to this topic. It would appear the devs have listened to the complaints I mentioned earlier, because the new monsters, Lagiacrus and Seregios, have much lower drop rates for their parts than normal. Their gem drops at only a 1% rate from rewards and 2% from carves. However, the tempered versions have increased drop rates. Basically, you get rewarded with better drops for fighting the harder versions. This isn't a new concept for Monster Hunter. A high-rank monster will always drop its low-rank plate at a much higher chance. But I do believe this is the first time a monster has two different drop tables within the same rank, separated only by a difficulty scaling system. I think this is quite interesting, and shows the devs may agree with player feedback that they took it a step too far with Wilds, and are trying to dial in a better feeling reward system. Anyway, back to the rest of the video. There is one other thing to mention though. Alternate modes of grinding. This is a pretty modern invention in Monhunt. Supplementary progression systems that are only tangentially related to equipment material grinding. You see this with guild quests in 4 Ultimate, the Guiding Lands in Iceborne, and anomaly quests in Sunbreak. These are extra systems you unlock and are mostly or exclusively an endgame or post-endgame mechanic. Between all of them, they're essentially a ranking system. These systems typically lock additional things behind them, like more challenging monsters or unique upgrade materials that you can use to boost your gear slightly more. And most critically, these systems usually provide a very long-term grind to progress through. The Guiding Lands and Anomaly quests specifically could take up 100 hours of time to max out on their own. This presents essentially an alternative to monster material grinding, one with no RNG involved. You're just gaining experience points for every monster you hunt to level up your rank. In this way, it doesn't really matter if material grinding is easy, you'll get your grind regardless. Of course, these systems are usually only accessible in the endgame and only in the expansions. They do also harken back to an older form of grinding I overlooked, which is the rank grinds for Monster Hunter 1, 2, and 3, where instead of just doing key quests and urgent quests to increase your hunter rank, your online rank was basically an XP bar, and you simply had to do any quests to gain XP and level up to access higher ranks of monsters. To sort of bring this all to a point, grinding is an endless problem in games, with likely no real solution. The developers can really only decide on a path and stick to it, consequences be damned. It does make me wonder though, what would make the most amount of people happy? Community sentiment is real, and while it doesn't represent all views of all players, it can give you a sort of room temperature on how people feel. We've seen this with Wilds, where the most common sentiment online you can find about grinding is that it's too easy, and now the devs are trying to respond to that. How far could the pendulum swing before the opposite reaction occurred though? I would venture to guess that going back to true 1% drop rates would be a step too far. I think the average modern Monhunt player probably doesn't want to have to kill Rathalos 100 times just to get his armor, let alone anything else. I think the greatest compromise would be the reintroduction of chase items. Chase items have been lost entirely in Monster Hunter. There's no longer any long-term grind gear like the Dragon Slayer, and there hasn't been for some time. I think having fairly forgiving drop rates as a standard, but some extremely time-consuming prestige gear to go after for those that want it, would probably satisfy a lot of people. Anyway, that's all for today. Thanks for watching. See ya.